Behold, my glorious supporter, Space Taking Space, has requested a discussion about what I'm going to call the burden of knowledge. This is a complicated matter that, luckily, I have done some thinking about before once I read through the prompt. So I think that I can summarize this one pretty effectively, but basically, in essence, the question is, how does knowledge, knowing more stuff, affect your limitations of choice? Basically, in what way, if at all, does knowing more stuff make you worse off in the sense of like having free will or having meaningful choices? So I'm going to read through the way that Space Taking Space has organized it is pretty interesting into three different little sections. So we're going to go through them. But again, the core question here is, does knowing more stuff make it harder to make a choice? I think the answer is yes, but usually in a good way. So we'll get there. So the three sections to sort of go through the argument. Language is what you called the first one. Basically, since we're communicating using a language that we largely didn't construct, like we didn't invent the language we're speaking, I did not have a at all significant impact on the way English is used, right? But it's what I'm speaking with. Doesn't that mean that the ideas we're going to end up expressing using that language are meaningfully limited to the ideas that are even in that language? I get this. You know, the idea, for example, is there are lots of times, if you know about foreign languages to your own that you started with, that you know that there's a word in another language that has a connotation or meaning that doesn't really exist in the language you're speaking. And so you know that idea, but it just kind of isn't a word in the language you're talking in. I think that's the easiest example. So doesn't that kind of mean that by speaking English, there's just only so many ideas that are ever going to be expressed because English has certain limitations, or whatever language, you know? I don't think so. No. I get that. I think it's an interesting problem of linguistics, but I do think it's meaningfully refuted by essentially writing is the act of expressing those ideas that way. First of all, I think that most of the time that you read a good or accomplished creative work, a lot of what that work is doing is constructing a very complicated idea or a very specific idea using just a lot of words. You know, one of the magical things about language and about prose and poetry is that there's sort of an emergent intelligence phenomenon of sorts where you write this whole thing and the sum effect is, let me give you an example. When I was in college, one of the things I did for my final exam to graduate college, it was called our capstone. I was an English major and I was a creative writing focused English major. So one of the things I had to do was write a novella, about an 100-ish page short book about mostly whatever I liked. I think the restriction was I couldn't be a biography. It had to be fiction, or if it was a non-fictional essay, it had to be like about me, for example. It had to come from me. It couldn't be like research based, you know, which is great because I absolutely despise research. So I wrote some stuff, and one of the restrictions for the assignment was that we needed to use a couple of works as source material. Part of the assignment was to advance beyond the basic level of taking inspiration from other people's work, which interestingly enough is actually the second of the three parts of Space Taking Space's Parley requests, formulations. So I'll get to that in a minute, but we had to pick a few works, 2 books in my case, and take meaningful inspiration from them without aping them, like without just copying them, basically. So the 2 works I picked were Haruki Murakami's Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, which I highly recommend, and Anne Gueretta's Sphinx, translated into English. It's originally in French. I recommend that book as well, although I think the beginning of it was a lot stronger than the rest. For me, it worked much better. I will briefly explain what those 2 works were, since we're here. This is going to be a pretty literary parlay in any case, so we might as well. I think we're right at home, because it makes the point. Haruki Murakami's Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, as you might be able to tell by that mouthful of a title, is essentially 2 books, alternating chapters. Half of it, every other chapter, is Hard-Boiled Wonderland, a book that is that, if you want to say it that way. And the other half, every other chapter, is The End of the World, a book called that, I guess. One of the books, is essentially a sort of I don't really know how to describe crime thriller, but it isn't rom-com with weird sci-fi element. It's strange, but it's a somewhat grounded sci-fi light narrative, like in the world. It's not, magic or whatever. It's about a dude who has some events happen to him in his relatively recognizable everyday life. And then the other half is this sort of nightmare apocalypse magical dreamscape thing that the gimmick of the book, I think anyway, and I don't say gimmick in a bad way, it really defines the text, is how reading that sort of crazy fantastical thing adds this off-the-page influence to what you read when you read the relatively more normal hard-boiled wonderland, a normal sci-fi a little bit, but mostly rom-com-y. I don't even know what genre to call this thing. I'm just using words to give you a vague idea, right? Kind of normal and then fantastical. You read the fantastical thing, and then on the next page, it's kind of normal, and nothing about the way it's written really, or not a lot anyway, makes you think fantastical, but you just read a page of this crazy fantastical thing, and so you're kind of primed to think, I'm sort of seeing the world through this different lens. And I think that that book essentially accomplishes the effect of showing you how perspectives create this kind of lingering after image on the way that you view other things in the world. And I don't know that there is really a word for that effect, really, that really encapsulates that effect if you haven't experienced it in a pretty controlled way like that. And that book essentially is a word that evokes that feeling. Likewise, Angareta's Sphinx is a play with gender. Angareta is part of Oulipo, which is a French experimental writing group, and one of the things that Sphinx is doing is trying to play with gender. Now, French, you might be familiar, is a very gendered language. The words have gender. So, especially in the original French, it's very hard to write French without gender, without gendering everything. In English, it's easier, but still not easy, for sure. And even just for humans, I mean, the world is often cast in gender for us when we're born into it, so it's hard to just remove that. It's not really even a matter of bias in a way, it's just, again, like you said about the language thing, the terms of the world we're in are built in gender to some degree, and there are some of us that don't really like gender, so it's really interesting to think, okay, well, let's say we just eliminate it. Can you even do that, And the book does this interesting thing where instead of trying to, or at least I think this is what it does. If you want to read this book and figure out for yourself, then don't listen to this, but jump like a minute ahead. The book does this interesting thing where instead of trying to avoid, like, for example, gender stereotypes, the book just does them. And sort of rather than removing anything that would make you think about gender, it just puts in so many contradictory gender details because this person just isn't meant to particularly have one way or the other, if you want to think of it that way, that it kind of bullies you into giving up on gender as being useful. Like, rather than trying to eliminate it, it just sort of, the book is like an exercise in demonstrating how gender can be unhelpful. And so eventually you kind of give up on interpreting the character in the book as being a gender simply because it becomes unhelpful to think that way. And it feels rather natural. And I think that's a real achievement that I thought was really interesting. So I did something like those two elements. Those are not all the things about those texts at all, but those were the two elements that I took into my own work. Okay, so what I mean about this language point is when you say, knowledge limits your choices and what you can express because the language you're talking in might not have those ideas, I think that is the entire point of writing. I think you make a good point. That is a limitation of language, which is why we often have to go on at length about things, why oftentimes it takes a long time to discuss something because indeed there is no single word for many of these things, and to evoke that feeling sometimes it takes a while. Poetry is, in a way, the art of evoking a concept for which there is no word in a short format, even though it requires more words than that to evoke the feeling, in theory. and yet you somehow do it in less. That's how I would define poetry. I do think there's a way of thinking of poetry where it's inherently an exercise of brevity, and even long poems, I think you'll find, if you think about Paradise Lost, the Iliad, the Odyssey, that they're defined by how they express ideas in a relatively short period of time. Again, I know, I know, they're not short. Believe me, I know. But they are in some way attempting to express those ideas in a shorter format than you otherwise would think you would be able to, or in some way. Anyway, okay. Oh boy. Just having some flashbacks to, anyway, moving on. So yeah, I mean, there's also some other aspects of this language part. Yeah, it's common for advanced writers to use words in somewhat new ways and kind of define, when you say, we didn't make the language we speak in. We did a little tiny bit. We did, language evolves based on how people use it. And we all have used the languages we speak in some small ways that are not encapsulated within the language. We do move beyond the original ideas from the language in a little bit, a tiny bit. And I think that really good writers do this a little more in a very controlled way, not a ton. They're not making up words all over the place, but in small ways. You'll often read a really good piece of writing, and there will be a few times where a word is used and you think, how clever, that is a really good use of that word that I'm not really familiar with. And some of those ways probably are genuinely new uses of that word. So that's something. And then, of course, finally, in philosophy, it's very common for people to just make up words, to have an idea, and then you just make up a word that is that thing. I make up my own terms or design my own terms for buildcraft concepts all the time, and I don't think that is an illegitimate process. There is a way in which when we have a thing for which it'd be helpful to have a word, but which we don't have one, we usually just make one. We just call, the philosophers among us anyway, have a bias to just, there should be a word, so let's make one. And so we do. So for this first subject about language limiting the ideas you can express, I'm going to come back to this, but I want to note how it definitely doesn't completely limit. There's a way in which it's kind of defining the terms of the discussion. That's definitely true. And I think there's a whole separate discussion we're not going to get into here about how linguistically different ideas will be expressed, like maybe more or less often or in different ways, depending on the language. But I don't think that hard limits the ideas you can express with that language. It just might correlate to how people express ideas using that language, or how much people tend to express certain ideas given a certain language, right? If there's a really good word for something in a certain language, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to predict that people will probably talk about that thing more in that language, right? But I don't think that it becomes impossible, just harder and different, probably harder and definitely different, to discuss that thing in a language that doesn't have a great word for it already. But we will come back to the language thing at the end. The second part is formulations, is what you called it, and I kind of talked about this a little before. You said there are various times when people say one must find inspiration from the works of others. Is this inspiration limiting all forms of creation to that of already existing creations? Or is this a learning process, improving and developing a different approach altogether? Yeah, so I mean, I think it is. I feel like when we say it's common to take inspiration from other stuff, right? Or, a thing I say to my other creative peers sometimes in my personal life is, if you don't know where your inspiration came from, it's not that you don't have any, it's that you don't know. You weren't paying attention. It's not that it isn't there. You didn't create something original. You're just unaware of where it came from. And that's not necessarily bad, but it's not different from taking inspiration from something else. You just don't know where the inspiration came from. I definitely agree that the things that we make are overwhelmingly a synthesis. But again, I think one of the key aspects of intelligence overall, let alone language and creative expression, is how emergent concepts come from these pieces that we were given. We can combine these things into more than the sum of their parts. And that's how the very fact that progress itself is possible is proof to me that you can indeed create new ideas from only existing ideas. There can be essentially no novel concept other than rearranging them in a different way, and that alone is sufficient to create a truly new idea, I think. That's arguable, but I think, to me, that's kind of good enough. I don't have that much more to say about this point, except that when you say, kind of limiting the ideas that we're going to express, I think it's worth noting iterating on things that are already there isn't bad. Not that you're saying it is, but we're kind of acting like you either can have original ideas, which is good, or you can't, which is bad. Well, it's not always bad. Like there are plenty of things that people have talked about much more that bear further discussion, like that we're not done with from a philosophical perspective, especially. I worry about death all the time. I and plenty of other people have talked at great length about death, and there is much more to say. I'm not saying you're not saying there is. I just think it's worth stopping here to point out, it isn't necessarily bad if these are the ideas we have. And furthermore, I would even zoom out to say, we don't really know that these are the limitations of language because the language was built that way, or if the language was built with those limitations because those are objective limitations. In other words, those are just the ideas that there are, and the language contains all of them because the universe limits the ideas. I don't necessarily buy into the idea that the language is the root cause of the limitations. That's another thing here. Okay, now let's pull it all together. Personality is what you called the final section. Basically, so does an increase in knowledge actually lead to more choice? Does understanding, a personalities better actually allow a person better knowledge of who they are or who they might be? As an example, you use personalities. I think that's a fine example. My shtick here basically is that just because we have these limitations, a lot of the time, this is just getting us past that sort of entry level where if we didn't know this stuff, if we didn't have this knowledge, this burden that knowledge gives us, isn't that we can't talk about other things. It's that we won't waste time talking about those other things, because most of the time, I believe, it is basically just a waste of effort to sort of catch up to where the general pool of knowledge already is. If that doesn't make sense, let me give you an example. In fact, actually, one of your fellow supporters responded with something I think is a really good example. Isn't that right? Thank you. You mentioned how I often lament repeatedly this idea with imbalanced PvP, where you'd have to pretend that some things in a game are equal to have basically any choice. There are times when a developer doesn't do a good enough job balancing stuff in PvE, and then people say, well, it doesn't have to be balanced because it's PvE. But for a lot of people, they want the best thing. They want to make a good choice. They don't want to pretend it's a choice that is worthwhile and they just like the choice. They want it to be a genuinely good choice. And what feels the best for a lot of people is combining it was a good choice and it's a choice that I feel good about at the same time. And that's what feels really good. So a choice you feel good about, that's subjective. Making things unique and having many aspects to them, that correlates with more choices people will like because there's just more choices. But the thing about the choice being good is often largely mathematical at its core. You need to make options that are meaningfully different from each other. So to wit, this whole thing about does having more knowledge give you more choice, restrict your choices? It appears to, but the truth is you didn't ever have that choice to begin with. That's what I'm getting at here, right? With language, it's it does maybe limit the terms of you expressing an idea, but if you didn't have the language, you wouldn't be able to express you wouldn't really have a way to discuss that thing. You wouldn't even be at the starting line. The same thing in games, where if there are two weapons and you don't know that one of them is literally just better in every situation than the other one, perhaps because you don't understand the game's math or mechanics well enough, or because there's a typo in one of the descriptions, or the description is unclear, that looking at you, Warframe and Genshin Impact. Anyway, you might not know that they're not equal. So that lack of knowledge gives you a choice, but it's a fake choice. You know what I mean? You don't really have a choice. It's just because of your ignorance, it is feasible to pretend that there is a real choice. Whereas if you had the knowledge, you'd know what was true before, which is that there actually isn't a choice. And again, in games, thankfully, this doesn't happen too often in games that have meaningful buildcraft, but I'm just pointing out that in life, for example, there are some very common arguments in philosophy that we have well and truly progressed past, and there's really no point in hashing them again. Yes, you'll take inspiration when you discuss them in all likelihood from people who've talked about them before, but that's not limiting the ideas you have. That's just getting you past the initial premises that we've just kind of already hashed out. Like, I really do feel like, although it's true that you can't take people's premises as gospel. You know, sometimes people have assumed something and you want to get rid of that assumption. Especially, I'm using philosophy as an example a lot, but it's true. In philosophy, it's often true that there is little productive point in going back to the basic premises of a piece of work. You should just move on from there, is how I often feel. So for example, what's a good example? There's a lot of ways you could give an example of this concept. Let's say something like the trolley problem. Let's do that. Why not? Everybody loves the trolley problem. If you don't know what the trolley problem is, it's the idea that you're beside a set of railroad tracks and there's a lever next to you that switches the tracks from here to here or whatever. The train is coming and there's a person strapped onto the tracks. There are 3 people strapped to the tracks, and the train is going to hit those 3 people if you don't pull the lever. If you do pull the lever, the train will shift and go this way instead, and it will hit 1 person trapped on the tracks, right? So if you pull the lever, less people will die, period. But you'll have pulled the lever. In early philosophy classes, like your Philosophy 101 class, this question will come up, and a lot of people will get hung up on the idea that you did something, like you pulled the lever. So even though 2 less people die, now you're guilty because you did something, basically, right? And you'll forgive me for just espousing my opinion here, but that is incredibly naive and immature. From a philosophical perspective, who cares that you performed a physical action? You were the agent of change. You were the only thing that was going to affect which outcome happened. So if you don't pull the lever, it's your fault for not pulling the lever. You know, like what? If you're a babysitter and you don't feed the child that you're babysitting, it's your fault for not feeding the child. It's not somehow not your fault because you didn't perform an action. It doesn't matter whether you performed the action of not performing an action. You were the agent that was going to fork that moment in reality. So the choice is on you no matter what you choose. It doesn't matter whether you physically touch the lever. You know what I mean? What if you touch the lever but then don't pull it? Does that make a difference? No, of course not. So anyway, whatever. You could disagree. It's fine. I'm just saying, to me, I had a philosophy class, and this has happened many other times in my life. I just think this is the best example. I had a philosophy class where we spent literally an hour and a half talking about just that thing I just said, which took me maybe 1 minute to formulate, right? Explaining the trolley problem. People got overly hung up on whether you touch the lever or not, which is infantile in my humble but very angry opinion, as you can tell. I'm oddly incensed by this particular thought experiment. Anyway, you get the point. I think that the fact that the trolley problem, that in that formulation, that exists, that does nothing more than get you past the tedious, unhelpful conversation where people just waffle about how you touching the lever makes the difference. No, forget that. It's not interesting. If you have an egotistical attachment to whether someone touches the lever, that's fine, and honestly, none of any of our business. But it isn't part of the philosophical discussion about which one is the correct decision. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter how you feel. Philosophy doesn't care about this is an opinion about philosophy. It is, of course. Philosophy could care about how you feel. Whatever. You get what I'm trying to say. It just skips you ahead to the part of the discussion where there's something to talk about. That's how I feel. A lot of the time, getting past those premises is really just catching you up to where the frontier of human knowledge is, the foundations. The frontier of human knowledge is. It's not really limiting you. It's just doing the legwork for you of getting rid of the stuff that we're already done with, you know? Now, it's funny here. I made this whole discussion. We talked through this whole thing, and the final point I made is basically that tutorial stuff it should just be taken as a given, and we should just move on, right? That's my answer to this overall question, because overall, thousands of years of human writing tend to be a pretty good authority on, a thing gets popular because it compels smart people to read that piece of literary work. But there are some key aspects here that make this very different from, for example, looking at a build guide on the internet. You might be asking, Zandy, doesn't that mean that we should just take the common advice about video game builds as gospel as well? No, there are two critical differences. The first one is that when a text, when a piece of literature or philosophy gets popular, it gets popular because learned, intelligent, largely, people with a lot of time on their hands devote meaningful amounts of time to really engaging with it. That is completely untrue of when a YouTube video gets popular. It could be popular because usually it's just because it's general. It's not because it's good, it's because it's broad. Sometimes broad things are good. Sometimes it's about something that everybody thinks about, or sometimes it's about something pretty niche, a specific build in a video game, but it suggests an approach to that thing, to think about that thing, that is so broad that everyone can understand it, which usually means the approach is reductive and at worst literally just incorrect. So that's one difference. Something, a broad human concept in our library of intelligence in the world becoming popular is not the same as like some knowledge in a video game for recreation getting popular, because what it means for that information thing to be popular and this build thing to be popular are very different. It's actually a statement of value for that information to be popular. It really isn't a statement of value for a pop culture or like video game thing to be popular. It just means it's broad. Whereas again, like an intellectual paper or a study, a research paper, that getting popular is more immune, less affected, not completely immune or unaffected, but less affected by just being broadly applicable, right? The only people reading it are people that kind of know what's going on with it. So it doesn't get popular based on whether it's easily understandable necessarily. It gets popular, at least in a significant part, based on whether it's like actually good, so that's one thing. And then the second thing, of course, is that these things are knowledge about stuff that doesn't have an immediate payoff, basically. Where I'm going with this is there's no incentive to make something that's just easy to understand and reductive. There's no incentive to be reductive. Whereas it kind of like I was saying before about a build advice thing being popular, you get a payoff if you actively remove information, whereas with these kind of philosophical discussions, you don't. The only reason people are reading them is if you're thorough, and the most common response to them is, but what about this detail you didn't include? Whereas the most common response to these build things is, oh, this was so easy and helpful, which again, that's fine. It's just not really a statement of value about those things. So that's why I'm saying overall that in general, again, just in general, I think that the base of knowledge that in some ways limits or defines the terms of our discussions is basically just saving us the time of doing the legwork that previous humans already did. It's catching you up to the frontier of human knowledge. There's not really that much of a point, although there are some rare exceptions, to going back and doing the legwork through all those things again. Those things are largely, in my humble opinion, just a waste of time. And a lot of the time when people talk about them and you kind of know where this is going, it's a huge pain. On the other hand, we have video game buildcraft, which has some very different influences on it. It gets popular for very different reasons. And the purpose is also very different. It's largely recreational. And so those things becoming popular or well-known, what is going to be like the terms of discussion for a video game build, there's really no reason to believe that those are going to be good, useful, that they will correlate with being effective. They're just going to be what's general. And what is general is usually wrong. Most people are wrong about their creed on the world, their approach to the world, which is fine. Like most people don't spend their life espousing their opinions about those things and having them checked against other intelligent people like all of you. So of course they don't have a particularly nuanced opinion of the world. That's expected. That's nothing to be ashamed of. I'm not trying to be an elitist about it. I'm just saying I've, whether for better or for worse, devoted more of my time to thinking about that. So of course I have more of a developed opinion about that. It doesn't mean that it's actually more effective. Something that I like to bring up a lot when we talk about these deeper philosophical discussions is, do we actually gain anything by talking about this, really? Or does the sort of overall trajectory of humanity kind of just get you there anyway? Now, I don't believe it does, but yeah, it's arguable. I don't know. Yeah, maybe. I do this because I find it fun. It's my personality. I enjoy thinking about this stuff. I'm not doing it because I think it's inherently valuable. I think it's inherently enjoyable. I'm not willing to argue whether it's inherently valuable. I don't know. I have no choice. This is just who I am. I'm going to do it anyway. I don't even care really whether it's valuable, actually. I care about talking about it because I think it's interesting, and I gather that that's the only reason any of you watch this half-hour video about it as well. So I hope that was an interesting answer to this question. It was fairly complicated, but I hope I was able to walk you through it in an interesting way. Overall, to summarize, I don't think that knowledge affects limitations of choice in a meaningful way. I think by its very nature, yes, it does. But much of what defines the way we use information is how we use it to synthesize further ideas using some, like, more than the sum of its parts formulations. So knowledge limits your choices, but the way we use knowledge is basically completely defined about how we circumvent those limitations. So I don't think it's a big deal. And it saves you so much time and there's no other alternative. So you wouldn't be better off not having that knowledge. The real question here to me is, would you be better off ignorant? And the answer is no. There isn't, for a variety of reasons, no. I hope you enjoyed the answer. Thank you for the interesting question. It's always fun how much of a variety we get here. And especially this month, we have a whole bunch of new people. So there has been a very colorful variety, or at least, I don't know what order these are going up in, but you'll see.